Why do Ontario winemakers need to be exceptionally unreasonable, stubborn, and pathological optimists? Which Ontario wines should you try next other than Icewine? And why should Ontario be at the top of your list of wine regions to visit? In today's episode, you'll hear the stories and tips that answer those questions in my chat with Matthew Gaughan. Matthew is actually interviewing me on his terrific podcast, Matthew's World of Wine and Drink. By the end of our conversation, you'll also discover how the Ontario wine industry has developed over time and which factors have influenced that growth most, why ice wine is as Canadian as maple syrup, beavers, and hockey, why Riesling is the #1 white grape in Ontario, how Gamay Noir is coming into its own in this region, and why wine culture is still relatively new in the country. Okay, let's dive in. Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 297. Now, in personal news, I want to share with you the first review for the new audiobook of Wine Witch on Fire, Rising from the Ashes of Divorce, Defamation, and Drinking Too Much. It's by Jane Staples from Ottawa. She posted it on audible.com. Natalie McLean narrates this riveting tale. She shares her vulnerabilities as life throws her one challenge after another, and she emerges through it all, showing her inner true strength. Her narration is pitched just right, making you feel that you are sitting together on a couch sharing her revelations in person. I highly recommend that you curl up in your favorite armchair and listen to this inspiring story. It's this summer's ideal way to beat the heat. 5 stars. Thank you so much, Jane. That means so much to me. You can download Wine Witch on Fire and start listening to it immediately on audible.com, Kobo, audiobooks.com, Spotify, Google Play, Libro.fm, and wherever else you get audiobooks. If you've started listening to the audiobook, please let me know. I am on tenterhooks about how my voice translates to narration in this book and would love to hear from you at natalie@nataliemclean.com. I'll put a link in the show notes to all retailers worldwide for the audiobook, ebook, and paperback versions at nataliemclean.com/297. Okay, on with the show.
With Natalie McLean from Ontario in Canada, and she's going to walk us through the wines in Ontario and give an introduction to those wines and tell us all about them. But first of all, Natalie, can you introduce yourself and let the listener know exactly who you are?
Sure, Matthew. It's great to be here with you. Thank you. So I'm based in Ontario, Ottawa, Ontario, nation's capital, but we'll get to the wine region soon. They're not exactly right here. I've been writing about wine for more than 20 years. I've been fortunate to have my writing recognized by various awards in the industry. I've just published my third book on wine. First one was Red, White, and Drunk All Over. The second one was Unquenchable. And the third was Wine Witch on Fire, Rising from the Ashes of Divorce, Defamation, and Drinking Too Much. So it's a trilogy. There's a bit of an arc going through those 3 books. I also have a podcast, Unreserved Wine Talk. So I was excited to connect with you this way because that's how I consume all of my content, whether it's books or podcasts or radio, it's all auditory and I just love the medium. So glad to be here. The only other thing I'd mention is that I teach online food and wine pairing courses at nataliemclean.com.
I'm getting a definite enthusiasm for wine and everything that's connected with wine. Let's talk about Ontario. First of all, where is Ontario?
Ontario is the southernmost province in Canada. It's located right in the center of the country. And the wine regions in Ontario sit between the 41st and 44th parallels or latitude. That's on the same parallel as, say, Willamette Valley, in Oregon, Tuscany in Italy, and Rioja in Spain, just to situate it. Of course, there are lots of soil and climate differences, which we can get into, but I think, Matthew, a lot of people think of Ontario wine regions as being far up north, I don't know, vineyards among igloos or something. But in reality, they hug the southernmost tip of the border of the province that borders the United States. If you like, I can get deeper into the three subregions of Ontario.
Yes, please do.
All right. So the three major ones are the Niagara Peninsula, which by far is the largest. It has more than 100 wineries. Prince Edward County has 30. Lake Erie North Shore has about 20. And then there are some smaller emerging regions dotted around the province that account for about another 45 wineries. So if we look at the Niagara Peninsula, the biggest region, it's a triangular arm of land where Lake Ontario and Lake Erie meet. And that's really important because especially Lake Ontario is up to 800 feet in depth in some places. So it acts like this giant water bottle. It slowly releases warmth in the fall that it accumulated over the summer to help those grapes ripen during the harvest. And then in winter, it protects the vines from freezing. So that moderating lake effect is limited, though, to the Niagara Peninsula because of the Niagara Escarpment, which is this massive ridge of limestone, dolomite, and shale that jutted up many years ago. And it created slopes and nooks and crannies that trap that moderating airflow. So that's why you don't see vineyards in Toronto or Hamilton.
We're at the end of May right now. What's the weather like in the Ontario wine regions? And can you describe the growing season and how it develops?
Unlike BC, which suffered a severe frost in January that's going to result in, sadly, 97% crop loss, Ontario did not experience that, fortunately. Now, both provinces, but we'll focus on Ontario, are cool climates, as is the rest of the country. So what that means is, actually, I have a quote here from the playwright George Bernard Shaw. There's a famous Shaw Festival in the heart of Niagara, so there's more than one reason to visit Niagara. But he captured the essence, I think, of what vintners face climate-wise in Ontario. And he observed, the reasonable man adapts to the world. The unreasonable man persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man. I think winemakers here must be exceptionally unreasonable, stubborn, almost pathological optimists, I would say, to brave our climate, because there are humid summers that can cause rotten mildew, rain right before the grapes are harvested, which of course can dilute their flavor, and then winters that can kill the vines. As one winemaker once told me, you can lose the whole field in an afternoon, a whole year of work. I know that can be said of other regions, but I think especially here we live and grow vines in a marginal climate. So that said, I think what a marginal climate does do is it produces wines with this sort of nervy, edgy vitality that sort of teeter. I characterize them as teetering on the edge of a nervous breakdown, which is exactly how I love my wine and my people. I find them far more interesting that way than like dependable, stable Cabernet Sauvignon. No offense to those wines or those type personalities, but we get a lot of vibrant wines here. If you like, I don't know how technical or hardcore you want me to be, but I can talk about comparison of Niagara's growing degree days compared to other wine regions in the country. It starts to get a little technical, though. For wine nerds like me out there, the growing degree days measured in Celsius degrees, they are defined as the sum of the monthly mean average temperatures over the growing season, which is marked for us, of course, as April 1st to October 31st. So if you compare Niagara, we'll get to Niagara's numbers in a minute, but Epernay, Champagne, France has 1,050 growing days in terms of the season for the grapes to ripen from bloom to harvest. New Zealand, 1,200, BC, 1,200, Beaune, France, 1,415, Washington, the Yakima Valley, 1,426, Napa, 1,450, and then Niagara Peninsula, 1,485. Lake Erie North Shore, the most southern wine region, though it's smaller than Niagara, 1,528 days. So we have a long growing season, but it's cool. Of course, I know that translates, Matthew, into wines that have great phenolic ripeness and complexity, but not a lot of sugar, and therefore they do tend to be low in alcohol. Again, nervy, edgy, vibrant.
Can we talk about the history of the wine industry in Ontario? When did it start and how has it developed?
We go back to 1811. Johann Schiller transplanted Labrusca and hybrid grapes on 20 acres, or planted them on 20 acres in Ontario. Then in 1866, Kentucky grape growers planted Catawba and Delaware vines on Pelee Island and established Ontario's first known winery there. It's called Vinvilla Winery. Today it's called Pelee Island Winery. And for years, Matthew, Ontario wines were made from the winter hardy Labrusca grapes, and they produced nasty little wines that were fortified with brandy to be even drinkable. Their alcoholic strength named them the nickname block and tackle, because after drinking them, you could tackle anyone or anything. Then in the 1960s and 70s, Canadian wine went through a very grim, cheap, and sweet period featuring a menagerie of wine names like Baby Duck, Gimli Goose, Fuddle Duck, Pussycat, and others. There was even one founded by pioneer Thomas Bright that was uncharitably dubbed Bright's disease. So it was not an august start to the industry. But then in 1975, Donald Zeraldo and Carl Kaiser of Enniskillen were the first to get a commercial winery license almost 50 years after Prohibition. So that was a step in the right direction. And then really things started to kick into gear in 1988. That's the year they banned Lambrusca, nasty Lambrusca grapes, from being in table wine. But also they started the Vintners Quality Alliance, VQA, which is our appellation system for Ontario wines. It's similar to France's AOC, Italy's DOC. And they're just guidelines for what type of grapes you can grow, yields, and all that sort of thing. Of course, another spur was our American friends south of the border, the 1989 Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, and then the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1994 really opened the borders, ended protectionism for the most extent, tariffs and duties on wines, and we had a freer open border. So that really ratcheted up competition, and with that goes quality.
What's happened since? How has the Ontario industry developed?
It's developing very quickly. It's small still. You heard the numbers for the wineries at the beginning. So this isn't a large region. In total, we produce somewhere around 35 million cases, or 400 million Canadian dollars. That's important because you got to knock off 30% if you're talking US dollars total for Ontario. But Ontario produces 90% of wine in Canada. 8 wineries individually in California produce more than all of Canada. So we are small region, small but mighty. Things have gone well in terms of quality. There's growth, there's new wineries, there's experimentation, there's better knowledge of our soil, our grapes, our climate, as winemakers drill down and perfect what we have here. And of course, all the trade that goes on with various winemakers doing stages around the world and expertise coming to our region. It's all benefited Ontario.
Let's talk about the wines, and let's start with Icewine, because that's what Ontario is probably most famous for internationally, in particular Niagara Peninsula. How did Icewine develop in Ontario, and how are the wines made?
Yeah, I have to agree with you there. Icewine is like as Canadian as maple syrup, beavers, hockey night in Canada, and those igloos. It developed, again, Enniskillen kind of put Canada on the world map when in 1991 it won the Vin de Grand Prix Honneur at one of the largest and most prestigious wine competitions in France for its 1989 Icewine. But let's back up. Of course, Germany has been producing Icewine far longer than Canada has. But we're blessed with the most consistently cold climate on the planet. We produce Icewine every year. Germany produces it 3 to 4 years out of 10, among other sweeter styles. So Enniskillen was fundamental in kickstarting that. The Icewine industry has expanded. It is Canada's largest export at 45 million Canadian. One of the largest regions is Asia. We get a lot of Asian tourists visiting and touring our wineries. Signage is at a number of wineries in both languages. And so it's a growth industry. But what you're strongest at can also be your weakness, because I think what happened to Canada is that we became known only for Icewine, whereas I think a lot of the excitement here is in dry table wines, both still and sparkling. But I got to say, Icewine is delicious. It's a tide of incoming pleasure. It's like apricot richness and peach preserve, and it's only 10% alcohol. It's not a fortified wine, so it's beautiful. Anywhere you think of Sauterne from Bordeaux, switch in your Icewine, whether it's at the beginning of the meal with foie gras, if it's still kosher to eat that, or anything else, or at the end with your cheeses or dessert or whatever.
Yeah, if you're in France, foie gras is not an issue. It is. Whereas here in California, it keeps getting banned, even though there's a lot of really bad food that is definitely illegal.
That's another podcast, but yes. Oh, I should add, Matt, just some interesting stats before we leave Icewine. Now, it's usually sold in the half bottle because a little goes a long way when it comes to sweetness, and those sell for $50 to $80 Canadian. But it's because it's such a risky, expensive wine to make. So they harvest usually either in late December or early January, and they can lose up to 60% of their crop because of weather and pests. The starlings, deer, rabbits, everybody loves those sweet grapes that are very desiccated. They've lost all their moisture, and that's what you want before you press these little grapes. Then they need to be picked at -8 degrees Celsius or colder, usually at midnight or overnight. So they remain frozen and they don't lose their juice or become diluted. And there were several presses at Enniskillen that broke, 2-ton winery presses at Enniskillen. These little glass pellets of grapes broke 2 presses there. Anyway, it's extreme winemaking on the edge, and it deserves its reputation, but there are many other wines that also deserve even more recognition, I think, here.
Just to conclude on Icewine, I know in Germany they press the grapes at the vineyard to make sure that they remain frozen. Does that happen in Canada as well?
Yes, because you don't want to transport them anywhere and have them start to melt. And there's been, I don't know, lawsuits and things going on about icebox wine. You cannot artificially freeze these. So you can't be even transporting them in a frozen container. They need to go from the vineyards to the presses on site. So it needs to be quick.
Mm-hmm. And are there legal rules about Icewine that producers have to follow?
Yes. So -8, you have to wait till it gets to -8 degrees Celsius to pick. You can't pick them warmer than that. There are only certain grapes that must be used. Typically, the 2 biggies are Riesling and Vidal. Vidal's a hybrid, but it makes a luscious sort of apricot-rich kind of ice wine, whereas Riesling tends to have this silver stream of acidity balancing the sweetness. It's my favorite style. And now these days they experiment with Cabernet Franc and Gewürztraminer and all kinds of different grapes, but the 2 biggies are Vidal and Riesling.
I've tried Enniskillen's Cabernet Franc, and it is extremely delicious. So you mentioned Enniskillen quite a lot there. That's the one producer that people are most likely to find for Icewine outside of Canada. Let's go on to the dry wines that aren't Icewine, which I really wish were more widely available. They're quite hard to get hold of. But when I have tried wine from Ontario, it's been really good, particularly Chardonnay. But let's start with Chardonnay.
So it's a cool climate grape and style the way we make it here. Of course, Chardonnay is the winemaker's grape. It can be anything you want it to be. But here in Ontario, the style is more in the stylistic nature of, say, Chablis. I think the best examples are often unoaked. But if there's oak, it's not heavy-handed. It's zippy, it's light, it's refreshing. But it's still complex with lots of minerality and zip and green apple bite to it. There's an international, I don't know if you've been to this festival, Matthew, but I4C, I think it's what the cool kids call it, but the International Celebration of Chardonnay. So I always get the acronym mixed up, but it's a big Chardonnay festival, July 25th every year in Niagara. And they invite cool climate producers of Chardonnay from around the world to gather in Niagara. And there's a big tasting along with Niagara Shards and events and fun and that sort of thing. But with the Chardonnay is 14% of white wine production in Ontario. Riesling, it comes in at number 1 at 18%.
And can you recommend any Chardonnay producers that you particularly like?
Oh, so many. I just go down the roster. And these producers I'd also recommend for their other dry, sparkling, and ice wine productions. So Marianissen, one of the older family wineries, Westcott Vineyards, more of a new winery, Henry of Pelham. And they also have the sparkling offshoot called Catherine Cuvée. Redstone, Toss, Cave Spring is probably the Riesling master, but their Chardonnays, their cool climate Chardonnay is beautiful.
What about Riesling then? You've just mentioned it. So obviously we've talked about the Icewine, but what about the other styles of wine?
So Riesling, the number one white grape variety here in Ontario, is really undervalued. It is, I think, I don't know, like everybody knows Chardonnay as a brand name, as a badge, as a grape, and feels safer with Chardonnay. But once they try Riesling, they just, oh my gosh, there's so much flavor there. And the styles here, other than the ice wine, and we do make a late harvest wine, which is not as sweet as ice wine. You can imagine it hits right in between a dry style and the ice wine. They do tend to be dry Rieslings. There can be a bit of residual sugar, but often you get a nice bone dry Riesling, and it's just so food friendly. It just will pair just about with anything. It's low in alcohol. And again, Riesling loves Ontario's climate. It loves the cool climate. It thrives here.
How would you compare it to Finger Lakes Riesling?
I'd say they're cousins, but probably on the father's side, not the mother's side. I don't know. I love Riesling in its many forms and colors, like whether it's Finger Lakes or Germany or Washington State, Niagara. They each have their individual signatures. I think what Finger Lakes and Niagara share, other than being proximate to each other, is a transatlantic signature. They've got this sort of old world heritage, but with the new world vibe. I don't know if that's a mashup that says nothing, but to me, it's like it isn't the austerity or something that's going on with German Riesling, which I still love. And it's not like a really sun ripened Riesling. It's this middle language that I think both of them speak very well. I don't know if that's helpful or just really downright confusing.
I haven't tried Riesling from Ontario, but I imagine it has that little bit of sugar, as you say, that you don't really notice because of the really high acidity.
The acidity covers over. You'd never think they were sweet, and yet they are, and that's why people really love them. They really wake your palate up.
What about other white grape varieties?
The other ones that we grow here are, I mentioned Vidal Blanc, which is a hybrid grape, Gewürztraminer, Pinot Gris, and Sauvignon Blanc. I would say are four others, but they're much less of them produced.
And what does Sauvignon Blanc taste like? I can imagine it being very herbaceous in such a cool climate.
Yeah, it does have that sort of herbaceousness, but I wouldn't say, again, really grossly generalizing, not as grassy as some New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc can be, and not as citrusy as, I don't know, what you think of Loire. I don't know, that's lemony sunshine too. But yeah, I would say it's herbaceous, but it's got some lime zest, some lemon notes, but not really grassy.
Let's go on to the black grape varieties. Maybe something that we wouldn't associate with the cool climate of Ontario, but what is that?
Yeah. So there are, of course, grapes, red grapes that do, or black and red grapes that excel in cool climates. Our number one red grape is Cabernet Franc, 14% of production. People often guess it's Pinot Noir, which is like the twin cousin of either Chardonnay or Riesling. It's number two. And then Gamay Noir, the grape famous in Beaujolais. But Cabernet Franc, I think we make so well. And it's as different from its sort of clonal cousin of Cabernet Sauvignon. They're not cousins, but one is an offspring of the other, Sauvignon Blanc, Cabernet Franc, Cabernet Sauvignon. It's got that edgy bite, but not bitter. But there's just more tingly aliveness, I find, with Cabernet Franc. It's got the dark berries and that sort of note, but a pleasantly herbal bite. Not unpleasant bell pepper, but I think it's just so savory, dried herbs. It pairs so well with so many like heartier dishes, meaty dishes.
And Gamay?
Another winemaker told me you need to have Gamay as a backup crop for all the money you're going to waste on Pinot Noir. Because Pinot Noir is the heartbreak grape because it's so difficult to make and to successfully market it. It's so expensive. You can lose so much of it. So Gamay Noir is the not plodding workhorse, but it's less socially up there with the cachet with the cool kids. But now it's coming into its own. There's the whole Go Gamay Go, and a lot of people are finding Gamay to be sessionable and crunchy and casual, and bistro fare goes great with it. So I think of Gamay sharing a lot of similarities with Pinot, like the bright cherry and the smooth, medium body, juicy acidity, not too much, but a bit more rustic country fruit, if you will.
Tantalizingly, you keep mentioning sparkling wine, and it feels that the climate of Ontario would be ideal for sparkling wine. So can you tell me about the sparkling wine scene in Ontario?
Yeah, it's marvelous. I think it's probably the best thing we produce that's not Icewine. I put it right up there on top, actually. And I think emerging regions like England, although those who live in England probably don't think sparkling wine is emerging, had it all along. It's growing and developing, but doesn't have the recognition yet worldwide here in Ontario. And of course, the base grapes are often the same as in Champagne, your Pinot Noir, your Pinot Meunier, your Chardonnay, but they'll produce and they'll use the Champagne traditional method, second fermentation in the bottle, but the bottles will come in at a third of the price of entry level champagne. So, $25, $30, $35 Canadian. And they're just magnificent. We've got the cool climate, we've got the limestone soils that are similar to Champagne. All the conditions are right for that. The grapes that go into it, everything. And the winemakers, of course, their improvements in technology, technique, and all the rest of it.
Let's talk about the market for Ontario wine. So I imagine domestically it's very strong, but what about outside of Canada as well?
Icewine is our biggest import, as I mentioned. And then when it comes to the table wines, still and sparkling, very little is exported. The UK is one of the larger markets, but the US would be the largest. UK, Asia. But it's a small amount. And usually what you'll find is that they're on high-end restaurant lists, or like a real boutique agency or liquor store will have it. We just don't produce enough to fill liquor chains anywhere, including in Canada. Like some of the larger producers can get into the Ontario Liquor Board stores, but I'd say probably 80-90% of wineries, wine produced in Ontario aren't in the liquor stores. You have to buy them directly from the wineries. So there's a lot of direct-to-consumer sales on mailing lists and that sort of thing, or visiting the winery sales. So very little of it gets outside the borders of Ontario, let alone Canada.
So is wine tourism a big thing in Ontario?
It's huge. It's huge and it's beautiful. You've got the wineries there. Of course, any wine region you visit is going to be pretty beautiful, especially any time during the growing season. But a lot of the wineries have restaurants associated with them, attached to them. So they're going to do pairing menus. There's all kinds of fun things you can do. Like one winery has an underground ice cave where you can drink ice wine at -8 degrees, where they, to simulate how it would be picking. They give you the parkas, by the way, to put on, because you go down there in the middle of July, you'll be freezing. All kinds of Instagrammable shots. They're really set up for this now. But there's other things you can do. There's spas, there's ballooning, there's bike riding, there's lots of things for kids to do. There's the Shaw Festival. So there's arts and culture. There's wine festivals that go on. I mentioned the Chardonnay one, but there's another one in the fall in Niagara. There's an Icewine festival in the winter. Lots that you can do when you visit.
Yeah, I went to an ice bar once in Helsinki where you have a shot of vodka. I like the idea of having a glass of ice wine in an ice cave. So you mentioned the liquor board there. Can you explain exactly how the alcohol beverage system works in Ontario and how wine is sold?
Pretty much like about a few years after Prohibition, in that most wine in this province is sold by the LCBO, Liquor Control Board of Ontario. And some wineries have shops throughout the province, but not many. New legislation is coming in August 1st that will allow wines, beers, and anything but hard liquor to be sold in convenience stores. That's a real huge step for us. I think we're most closely aligned to, I don't know, is it Pennsylvania that still is run by the state? It's starting to open up. I take that as a sign not only of progress, but that we're probably heading into an election in Ontario. If they're freeing up the beer and the wine, you can get it anywhere. But that's a great thing, because that's going to allow smaller producers to get wider distribution outside their winery doors, where they may not be able to fill the channel or big orders from the LCBO. So the LCBO, yeah, still is the major seller. They're the second largest purchaser of wine in the world, second only to Costco. They're really big.
So it is crazy to think of these regulations that exist in Canada, as well as in other countries where it is state controlled. How do people consume wine in Ontario?
Because we're a northern country, we didn't have a wine culture. I think your wine culture and how you consume wine grows up with your own wine industry and matures that way. We had a beer and whiskey culture because that's always been made, just like the northern countries of Scotland and Germany and so on, although Germany has a long wine culture. My parents, they're from Nova Scotia, so it was always beer and whiskey on the table. I didn't have a taste for either. And so wine is still relatively new as a culture in the last 20 years or so. And in terms of how people consume it, I think that we're gradually shifting away from it's for a fancy occasion, only special days, to it's a thing that can enhance even casual dinners, family get-togethers. It's a nice alternative to hard liquor. I think my mission has been to say it's the drink of conversation. There's a reason we don't serve it in shooter glasses. It's meant to be enjoyed over a meal. And so that I think it just, again, goes hand in hand with the development of your own wine industry, your own appreciation, and the general spreading of wine culture.
So Canada, for such a big country, gets lost sometimes, and identity isn't always understood. And that's certainly true of its wines. How do Canadian producers in the wine industry really promote their wines abroad and give people an understanding of Canadian wine?
They can start talking about it on podcasts like yours, Matthew. That helps. Every bit helps. It's a hand sell. It's like books. There's no budget for mass advertising or big marketing campaigns. So you do it grassroots, whether it's through podcasts, social media. The Wine Council of Ontario sponsors trips to various countries and will take winemakers along to pour for influencers like sommeliers and media and government officials and so on. So you can make inroads that way, but it's a slow and steady process. And then the other thing that's happening is that the Wine Council is bringing influencers here, writers like Jancis Robinson, Andrew Jefford from the UK, Cara McNeil, Matt Kramer from the US. You should come, Matthew, for sure. I should put a bug in their ear for that. It'll happen by word of mouth when people talk about it, and also when consumers come here and visit the wineries and have a phenomenal experience. Because for me, even as a writer, I remember wines far more deeply when they're emotionally connected to the place I visited, to the people I spoke to, the land, to the food that was with the wine. And I think that's what we need to do for wine drinkers, is get them to visit here because it's quite lovely and there's so much else to do.
And does the wine industry receive much government support, or is the government a hindrance?
Yes and no. We tax our wines like a foreign import, which is just nuts in my mind. They've just raised the excise tax, which is really a sin tax on gasoline, cigarettes, and wine, alcohol, another 2% recently, whereas that same tax isn't at all in Italy, France, and so on. Even the United States has far lower taxes on its own wines than we do. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done because we still have that prohibition mindset of trying to discourage people from drinking by raising taxes. But what actually happens is that Ontario producers don't raise their prices because they're competing with a Chilean red that for a very price sensitive consumer. And so they just take it as a hit to their bottom line. So in that way, the government has not been helpful with taxes, but I think things are starting to change.
Okay, that's been fantastic. Thank you for joining me. And I've learned a lot about Ontario, and I definitely want to visit and definitely want to try more of the wines.
I'm going to let them know you have to come here and visit. If your listeners are looking for more resources, I mentioned the Wine Council of Ontario. Their website is just winecountryontario.com. I've listed all of the wineries in Ontario on my website, nataliemclean.com. And of course, the wines that I mentioned while we were chatting, I've reviewed all those wines. So your listeners can also find them on nataliemclean.com.
Please explore Ontario wine.
Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed my chat with Matthew. Here are my takeaways. Why do Ontario winemakers need to be exceptionally unreasonable, stubborn, and pathological optimists? Well, the playwright George Bernard Shaw captured it best. The reasonable man or woman adapts themselves to the world. The unreasonable man or woman persists in trying to adapt the world to himself, herself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man and woman. So Ontario winemakers must be exceptionally Unreasonable, Stubborn, and Pathological Optimists to brave our climate because there are humid summers that can cause rotten mildew, rain right before the grapes are harvested, which of course can dilute the flavor, and then winters that can kill the vines easily. As a winemaker once told me, you can lose the whole field in an afternoon, a whole year's work. It's such a marginal climate. But of course, that also results in spectacular wines. Number 2, which Ontario wines should you try next other than Icewine? Riesling is the number 1 white grape variety in Ontario, and it's really undervalued in my opinion. Everyone knows Chardonnay as a brand name and feels safe with Chardonnay, but once many people try Riesling, they realize just how much flavor they've been missing in their life. And number 3, why should Ontario be at the top of your list of wine regions to visit? First, it is stunningly beautiful. The scenery, the landscapes, the lake, the cliffs, everything. Also, many wineries have restaurants, so they offer delicious pairing menus. There are lots of other activities to do. For instance, one winery has an underground ice cave where you can drink ice wine at -8 degrees. There are spas, ballooning, bike riding, activities for kids, arts and culture, and wine festivals, and so on. In the show notes, you'll find the full transcript of my conversation with Matthew, links to his website and podcast, the video versions of these conversations on Facebook and YouTube Live, and where you can order my book online now, no matter where you live. You can also find a link to take a free online food and wine pairing class with me called The 5 Wine and Food Pairing Mistakes That Can Ruin Your Dinner and How to Fix Them Forever at nataliemclean.com/class. That's all in the show notes at nataliemclean.com/297. Email me if you have a sip tip question or if you've read my book or are listening to it at natalie@nataliemclean.com. If you missed episode 238, go back and take a listen. I chat about old vines, land stewardship, and the future of Ontario wine with Carolyn Hurst, owner of Westcott Vineyards. I'll share a short clip with you now to whet your appetite.
Old vines are very precious and really important to the quality of the wine, and the roots are down deeper. They're less vigorous. They don't produce as many clusters as younger vines. Every year, the vine produces all the new plant material is made up from the air, the water, the soil. A generation in a vine is 1 year, renewing itself every year.
I find old vines are like people. They may be more wizened, less vigorous, but they're more interesting because their roots are deeper.
So true.
You won't want to miss next week when I chat with Teresa Heredia, who has worked for some of California's most prestigious wineries, including Sainsbury, Joseph Phelps, and Gary Farrell, and has been nominated twice for Winemaker of the Year by the Wine Enthusiast magazine. She'll join us from her home in Sonoma. If you liked this episode or learned even one thing from it, please email or tell one friend about the podcast this week, especially someone you know who'd be interested in learning more about Ontario wines. It's easy to find my podcast. Just tell them to search for Natalie McLean Wine on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, their favorite podcast app, or they can also listen to the show on my website at nataliemclean.com/podcast. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week, perhaps a vibrant Ontario Riesling or Pinot Noir. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So subscribe for free now at nataliemclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.